beginning to record this. Paul, the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Manuel, thank you for this opportunity to share research with you and your colleagues. I wish I was doing this from a closer proximity, but that's the way things are in these days. And this technology is really meant to link us, whether we're 90 feet away or in our case, 9,000 miles away. So it's a pleasure to do this, and thank you all for coming for it. I also want to note, as Manuel said, this is joint work with Michael Cummings at the Walton School and University of Arkansas. And Michael has a stream of papers that build on some of these ideas. I think he's a great emerging scholar in this field for those of you who are interested in the issues I'll talk about today. This is a paper in progress. It's in a revision after a journal review and a revision request. And some of the things I'm going to talk to you today, which are different than in the early version you saw, reflect the peer review process. In particular, I'll show you some what I'll call micro data that we're now unearthing and using, and maybe a little bit about the background on it. And I look forward to your comments because they would be timely as we think about how to revise this paper, respond to some referee questions and editorial requests as it goes with it. So thank you for that in advance. So here's what I want you to come away with. If we get cut off, and of course that's a possibility. If we do, I'll cycle back on. But here's what I want you to come away with is one, that there's this asymmetry in what we know or think we know about gender and entrepreneurship. We know a lot, and we have a substantial research body, which I'll refer to in just a moment, about how women may differ from men as venture founders, as entrepreneurs running things. And I'll talk more about that. But we really don't, at least my diligent search for research around this, we don't know much about women as venture funders, as the venture capitalist side, as opposed to the entrepreneur. And that's what this research is trying to gain information to kind of unveil in ways for it. So, and I think there's a reason for it. It has to do with the fact that in conventional contexts, it's hard to observe and it's hard to think and theorize about women as different from men as venture funders. But so we have to think of an unconventional setting, and that setting actually, I think, is migrants and their remittances, where, as I'm going to show you, there's evidence, some of it generated by me, that migrant remittances go in significant, sometimes substantial part to fund, found, and grow new ventures. And so it provides us with an unconventional format or means to observe this gender issues in practice and to gain insight on the research question of interest to me. So what I'm going to do is, this is not really a theory-heavy paper. This is just a kind of theoretical logic to set up the empirical study for it, but there is a theoretical grounding. This is not just throwing data up in the air. And the grounding is around issues to remind us first about how and why migrants might have some comparative advantages to more conventional venture investors, some kind of a venture funding company and the like, especially in developing countries, especially for micro ventures. And then to go from there and to try and theorize, or at least build a logic about how women might differ from men in that regard, where migrants are remitting for venture funding purposes. And I'll try to develop a logic for that, grounded in some theories that we often use in transaction cost economics and sociological identity issues and the like for it. And then I'm going to move to the data, because that's really where things are. That's the important stuff. I'm going to talk about two sources, two pools of data. One I'll call micro and the other macro. And the micro stuff's the newer stuff. It's survey data from a major money transfer organization, Ria Financial, which has some advantages over other of the big money transfer companies like Western Union or MoneyGram. And I'm going to show you through survey work from customers coming up to them that there are substantial indications in this cross-sectional data that women differ from men, and they're more likely to remit for investment purposes in ways that are consistent with our claim that remittances fund new ventures, and that women are more likely to do that, to remit for that. And then I'm going to move to some macro data that come from more conventional sources that give us a little bit more leverage on issues such as model identification. I'm going to show you some panel data analyses that are consistent with the micro, that demonstrate that that diasporas, communities of migrants abroad that have higher percentages of women, their remittances tend to move the dial positively, tend to move venture funding perceptions in developing countries more than the same percentages from or the remittances from diasporas with more men. So we're going to put these two together, and I think what they help us to understand is intent differences. Women are telling the people that handle their money that it's more likely that's going to for investment purposes, and then effect purposes about how money that's coming from diasporas with more women in them tends to move the dial more in venture funding, other things being equal. And then I'll talk a little bit about maybe some magnifiers, if we have opportunity for it, issues about that might differ in developing countries with a greater need for foreign capital because other conventional sources like FDI are less often there, and what that does to this venture funding effect, this gender venture funding effect. And then a little bit about opportunity, where I'm going to examine issues about the role of women and the ability of women to participate in the economy, particularly as entrepreneurs, and how that affects these venture funding effects that are gender. So lots of things to talk about. The main thing, though, is to help us understand in this unconventional context how women may differ from men in terms of the way they remit money, and to gain insight on venture funding differences. So with that, let me move ahead. So this is just a quick picture. These are journals that are devoted to women and venture funding. There's special issues on that same issue. There are articles that come out in the general management and general economics journals around those issues. This is just a sampling of it. There's centers for the study of women as entrepreneurs. All of this tells us that there is no dearth of information about how women may differ and why from men as entrepreneurs. Altogether very important from a business school standpoint and management standpoint, also from a public policy standpoint, because we know about the role of small business, private sector-led development, how that's preferred to so many other kind of recipes for economic development. And so women play an important role in that. Know lots about that. This is where I got interested in this question, sort of looking around for, the pieces in the general management, general economics, general finance journals that examine the role of women versus men as venture funders, the venture capitalists. And what you find is it's a really thin pool. Anecdotal studies of women as venture funders in Sweden, or in kind of community investment groups like reading circles in London for it. It's a really thin, no cross-country systematic evidence that I find, and that I think in my work with other people in this field that they find. And I think there's some reasons for that. I'll just pick out one. So there are a couple of guys at Harvard Business School who have been spending time trying to understand the role of women in venture funding firms. And what they find is they're just so few. Something around women make up 8% of senior investment teams at major VC firms. And the biggest indicator that a woman is going to be on the senior investment team is if her father owns the company, is a partner, major partner in the company. So, not surprisingly, it's like Sexist Week starts early here. So it's hard for us to observe women. And while we can theorize about it, it's, so much of our theory is based on what we observe anecdotally. Just hard to do that for it. So this is where I got to thinking about research I've been doing around this phenomenon, migrants and their remittances. Won't go into the background for it, but I've been studying this for about a dozen years and published some papers around basic issues about how remittances move and whether it gets involved into types of venture investing that we would care about in a management setting, in an international business setting, in a development setting. These are the flows. I love showing people this set of flows. Comes out of the World Bank. And what it shows at the end is that remittances have become, in many developing countries, the single largest inflow of foreign capital. But what I love to do in comparing it with FDI or portfolio flows or official development aid, that final lower, is I love not talking about the upward slope, but how little variance there is. We're in the middle of what could be another Great Depression. So it's sometimes helpful to look at what happens to remittances during downturns. So even looking at 2008, 2010, the Great Recession, what you see is substantial fluctuations in every other private source of foreign capital, portfolio flows and FDI. And meanwhile, remittances just barely take a breath. So it's a steady increase It reflects the fact that there's so many more people on the move. The virtual country of diaspora, made up of people not living in their country of birth or early childhood, is come close to 300 million people now. And that's up from about 60 million people, 70 million in the early 70s. The fall of the Berlin Wall has really changed this. And then with that, the ability to remit money. Wherever we would see channels of migration from developing countries to the developed north, or in the case of South Africa, from much of sub-Saharan Africa to South Africa, you see the reverse in terms of remittance corridors. And that has literally enriched so many financial institutions, especially the money transfer organizations I'll talk about. It's also enriched some of the more traditional means of moving money, the Hawala Dar in Muslim majority countries that have been doing this for centuries for it. So it's been a fascinating and relatively recent phenomenon. As you see with the numbers, I think it was around 100 billion US dollars that moved through remittances in 2000, and now it's heading towards 700 billion, and about 4/5 of that, to 5/6 of that, is going to developing countries. So lots of money coming from lots of people, the 5th largest country in the world, if diaspora were one. This is from just a screenshot of some early work that I did on this question. I was just trying to document how remittances had significant and at times quite substantial positive impact on the perceived availability of venture funding in developing countries, new business starts, even other kind of bigger economic development outcomes, such as the opening of economy, making them more, exports increase, imports increase, economic openness. This is just a shot to demonstrate on the x-axis per capita remittances to that developing country, and on the y-axis of venture capital access perception scale that comes from the Mike Milken Institute in Los Angeles. And then this is a scatter plot of observations, annual observations on that from about 40 plus developing countries in the mid-2000s. The extreme right observations you see there are Lebanon and Jamaica, 2 places where there's always been a lot of remittances from a spread out diaspora. What I think is so interesting is the simple response from about $0 to about $70, $80 per capita in remittances. You just see how that has such a very substantial increasing relationship. And if you look at this from the panel data to kind of infer causation rather than just correlation, it's quite similar. So many of those countries that are going from 0 to 70, 0 to 100, they're sub-Saharan African countries. And so this fits up with a kind of perception that remittances are a lifeline for funding household consumption. That's the default. But part of household consumption has been hived off in significant, sometimes substantial part for the use of remittances and investment goods, one of which is starting a new business. Often something which is not explicitly admitted by the remitter. You'll say to them, what are you remitting for? Oh, I'm helping my family. What are they doing with it? They're buying a truck. What are they doing with the truck? Well, they're hauling things from the farm to wherever they need to, but at night it's a taxi. So talking about remitting to invest sometimes doesn't immediately come to mind in the remitter that it's also for a new venture, and yet it is, because they don't make the same distinctions as maybe a more conventional venture funder and venture capitalist would in the West about what goes on at home and what goes on in business in a separate place. So this is, I think, is really interesting. One of the other things we find with this work is that the positive impact remittances actually increases for migrants sending money home to developing countries with less education. And I think what that tells us is a lot of remittances are going to places in developing countries outside the big cities. They're going to rural areas, and they're going to what I'll call dual use investments like that truck, like the tractor. And they step in as more important for income purposes sometimes during catastrophes like droughts, but they have a steady contribution to household income via these investments, often dual use investments. So with that as a background, take as a given, or at least pretend as a given, even if you're a skeptic, that remittances, a substantial part, go to this. Now I want to get to the question of interest for it. Why would women differ from men when they send money home? We have a lot of information about women as remitters. For example, and as migrants, we know that women come later than men in diaspora. formation. They remit less per transaction than men, in part because they make less than men in those host countries for it. We also know that women remit for longer. They remit substantially longer than men, who identify more quickly with the host than home country and then cut relations with the household. We also know that women feel and support at least a perceived obligation to households. When they remit longer, it's not just to anyone, it's to households back home for it. So we have information on that. What we don't have is, what happens to the money when it's from a woman being remitted to that household in particular for it. So we need some theories about it. Sociologists have been looking at those other questions about women as remitters, and what they come away with is, when we talk about the migrant, which has this interesting social identity that really has both home and host country elements to it. And essentially that migrant, like any migrant, is trying to figure out the dual identity that goes with it. Women tend to identify for longer with the home country and the home country household for it. And for that reason, it's consistent with the idea that they might be able to finance longer term investments. Their time horizon back home is longer than men. There's also evidence that suggests that women have, again, this greater interest in the welfare of households and the communities around them. So there's a greater, there's an inference that comes from that around the kind of social returns, not just specifically for what happens in the household, but in the community compared to men for it. And then there's also, obviously, women have, in most developing countries, have far fewer opportunities to participate in the economy and the polity than men. And so remittances, in many ways, are limited to what they can do via, often from a woman to another household member that could be a woman as well. And so where we see with more opportunity for women have a larger role in the entrepreneurial economy back home. Women participate more in the political system back home, that there may be more opportunity also for that remitted dollar from them to go further. So we have some hypotheses that tell us that maybe women are more likely to remit for investment purposes, that venture funding purpose, and then that they do so maybe even more where there's a greater need and greater opportunity. Those are the predictions I want to explore with this micro and macro data. Let me talk about the micro stuff first. So first, I'm going to have a simple cross-sectional model. I'm going to try to estimate. I'll tell you where the data come from in a second. But what I'm interested in is understanding women versus men as their stated general remitting purpose. What do they generally remit for? And I've got a few controls I'm going to show for you, and then I'm going to show you some gender dummy effects and that include fixed effects for the host countries where they're living and the home countries where they're from. It's not a substantial model, but it has, I think it has a set of controls that that cause us to spend a little more closer time at looking harder at that gender effect for it. Would I like more? Love to, but you kind of take it as it comes. So the dependent variable is this agreement on a 1 to 5 scale of I generally remit to invest back home, and it's a 1 to 5, and it's for that immigrant I from living in host country J from home country K, and then what we're going to do is look at a series of controls for them that have to do with education and the like. I'll show you what those are about in just a moment. This is a really interesting population of about 718 migrants that come from, I think it's around 56 different, 50 or so developing countries, living in 4 host countries: Spain, France, Germany, and the UK. So this is survey data. It's like a 5-minute survey that takes place at the end of a transaction where a man or woman comes up and says, I want to send 50 euros back to Morocco or to Zimbabwe. And it only could be done, I think, at least at a big money transfer organization like the one I got a chance to work with a bunch of years ago. RIA Financial is probably the #3 player in the field of money transfer, where MoneyGram and Western Union are numbers 1 and 2, and they're huge. RIA is based in Madrid. It's a subsidiary of a company, a financial services company in California. And I just ran into these guys, won't go into the background for it, but they gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about their operations. And they were curious about remittance intentions for purposes of developing some value-added products, whatever added verification that the person who's receiving the money really is that person for certain reasons. Just like you would with any money transfer. So we set up a survey, and it happens to work really well for them because they own a number of their remittance shops. Western Union and MoneyGram typically don't. They put a machine in some convenience store, and then the proprietor there works the machine and does their thing. RIA has in those countries 36 company-owned outlets, actually around 50, 55 of them, that they have their own employees running. So this is a way for them to essentially kind of have leverage and to try out, experiment new things, and then send them out to those machines if it works, and to leave them be if they don't. So I had a chance, this was to work with them. We did a survey. We did it in 2011 and helped them develop some new products. It was interesting for me, and I put it away in a drawer and left it there for 8 years. It just happens. But as I was trying to deal with some referee comments, the comments were of the sort that were, I think I thought this data might help, and so I pulled it back out, and I think it does. So what does it tell us? These are migrants that have been abroad for 5 years or less. And there are reasons for that. Sometimes people will say they're from a country, but they've been away from the country for 60 years and the like. So what we wanted to do is make sure we were thinking about migrants and more recent migrants. I guess you'd say 5 years may not be the most, it's a medium term. It gives us a sense we have a real population of migrants. And as I said, it's a nice distribution in terms of both host country and home country for it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna estimate this model. It's gonna be an ordered probit model around this, 1 through 5, which is, 5 is higher. It's a strongly disagree, disagree, neither disagree or agree, agree, strongly agree. So, the ordered probit looks right for this. And then I'm going to analyze, most importantly, the gender dummy for female migrant. And then I'm going to show you a couple of things where we essentially can partition out the gender effect, also the intent that they tell you. Let me show you what it is. Look at the data. Here is, in this first case, this is kind of the base regression. Where the left-hand side again is, I think remittances are a great way to invest back home. 1 to 5. 5 is, I really strongly agree with that. And then a number of different attributes here, and I'll show you what some of those attributes are and what they tell us. First off, about 46% of the people that are surveyed are women. You're going to see in the next data that women are a little bit over half, around 52, 53%. This isn't too far, depending on the countries that we grab and the host countries where they live. So that seems to be representative. Migrant education is a 1 through 5 variable, where 1 is primary, 2 is primary and secondary, 3 is up through high school, 4 is university, and 5 is grad school. And what you find is, people generally don't have university education. They're somewhere in secondary or high school education for it. One of the things we asked is, we asked migrants about their proximity to others in their community or to food and other cultural things, to get a sense of whether they lived in a community or they lived separately for it. And so that's where that migrant living near others variable comes from. And then we asked a series of questions about the particular transaction that they were remitting. So not generally, but what's this money for? And you see a series of dummies. I'm remitting for business purpose. I'm remitting for home construction. I'm remitting for the help the household, but not for construction, the consumables. I'm remitting for education, healthcare, and then food and clothing. And then there was this catch-all that we had where it didn't seem to fall anywhere to say, I'm remitting to assist my family. And it ends up that's a really valuable dummy marker for it. Most every migrant in this survey picks one of those, and only one. But then some pick both, or two. And really the two, whenever you have some kind of combination, it'll be something specific that you see there, and then it'll be, and by the way, for the family generally. So this is a model that's built off of those ideas, and I'll show you how we can exploit that. So what you see, I think most importantly, is that when it's a woman, other things being equal, she's more likely to agree or strongly agree with the statement about that I generally remit for investment purposes. And one of the things we did is we asked them and described for them investments, and then asked them the same question with regard to savings back home. So one of the things that remittances do is they not just finance household consumption, they also finance the savings for that when remittances don't come through there. And what's interesting is the response of the female migrants to that survey is different. At least it is significant and positive for invest and not for savings on that. And what that tells us is that the migrant understands differences between those two purposes for remitting generally for it. And I think it's a really helpful check on these results. Other things might fit or not fit your intuition. You see that in this case, education, the better educated ones are more likely to answer that question, yes, about remitting. That's inconsistent with some of the research that I found. Might have something to do with the background of these remitters, the less educated nature of the remitters that we have. And then other types of things. They're living in a community, they're more likely, if this particular transaction is for family aid, that general family aid, they're very strongly. It's a very strongly able to do that. And then two specific uses. I'm remitting this time to help a business back home, and I'm remitting for home construction. Those are both positive and significant. And that's important because it's consistent with this idea that remitting to invest, and home construction is one of those things you depreciate rather than just consume, and as well as remitting for the business. What it tells us is that when they answer that question, remit to invest, sometimes they think explicitly about the business, sometimes they don't. They think about investment for goods like that truck that becomes a taxi at night. All of this tells us that there are differences that are significant. They're tied to the gender of in this case, the customer who's transacting. Their intent is different. They're more likely to remit to invest. Then what we did is we partitioned that female dummy into a couple of scenarios. Remember, we had that family aid. That's that kind of catch-all. So what we did is created dummies where it's a female, and they strongly agree with they've just mentioned family aid as one of the reasons for that transaction. You often did it as a kind of an add-on to whatever it was. And then we created a dummy which is female and not family aid. Then same for male and family aid. And then the omitted variable, the omitted level is male and no family aid. And you can see where what the means are in those responses for it. And what you find is small group of women who say family aid is one of the reasons for it, but again, positive, significant, at common levels. And when you compare that coefficient estimate to the omitted level and or to the other two dummied levels, you find that it's significantly larger. So women are more likely to remit for investment purposes, at least they tell us that, and women who think of family aid, general family aid, are much more likely than women who aren't. And I think what that tells us, this distinction is so important, at least intent-wise. So that's on the micro data. And that's there to tell us that we think we have the intent right when we go to the macro data and show you just a couple of results from that, and then I'll shut up and let you pose your questions and comments. So here now what we're doing is we're going to do a panel data estimation where the left-hand side is a perception that comes actually from the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, that produce an annual survey of venture funding availability, of conventional funding, of investing, all sorts of other indicators across all countries in the world. It's from a survey instrument developed by Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School back about 2000. It's a standard measure for cross-country work in this field. I'm going to regress it on some controls, and then on the remittances that country I in year T receives, then information on the percentage of women from that same country in that year that live abroad in the diaspora, and then I'm going to interact the two. Because what I want to know is when a remitted dollar comes from that diaspora back home, Morocco, and I know the percentage of women from Morocco living abroad, I want to understand whether as that percentage changes that the venture funding effect of the remittances change. So I'm going to do that. Now, it's a 48, almost 50 developing countries over the first decade of the 2000s. There is some overlap, but there's anything but a perfect overlap with that group that I just described in the micro data. But there is some substantial. And it's an unbalanced panel. This case, I don't think it's a big deal. I'm going to show you some of the results, and then I'm going to show you how, I'm going to tell you, for purposes of keeping it simple, that there are ways for us to be pretty explicit about the endogeneity of certain variables like remittances, which can be both affect and affected by venture funding. And what I'm going to tell you, and it's in the paper itself, is that we're careful about that, and we re-estimate and find consistent results when we use a dynamic panel generalized method of moments, or the Ariano-Bond system indifference estimator, to try an instrument for remittances and for all sorts of other potentially endogenous variables. They tell us the same thing I'm going to show you now. So let me show you now so we can get through this and get to your questions. Number of things that also affect venture funding availability in developing countries, and we have some of those. So you read down the list and they fit or they don't fit your intuition. Generally, they tell us, they explain a lot of the variation in venture funding, especially when they're paired with home country fixed effects and year fixed effects that are out there, but not reported here. The big deal is what you see at the bottom: remittances as a fraction of GDP, the female diaspora share, and the interaction of the two. And you know, the payoff is, as remittances come home from a diaspora with more women, or at least a higher percentage, then the venture funding effect, the positive venture funding effect, increases. And you can see it's somewhere around the mean women is about 51%. Interesting, just a little higher. When that gets to around 55%, then the remittance effect goes positive. And that's not one standard deviation. That's substantially before that. So we know that a lot of the developing countries have that positive effect as women increase in the diaspora percentage for it. But what it tells us, that's the case. Now, remittances with 0% women don't contribute. In fact, you might say it's negative. Of course, there's no diaspora with 0% women. And the way I think to read that remittances variable when it's as an individual variable contributing to the interaction is just doesn't. It does what it's supposed to do as a default: fund household consumption of those other things, food, clothing, and the like. But as the percentage of women abroad increases, it has more of an effect on that other thing, the investment side of it. And that's consistent with the micro data. A couple of things. These are essentially a kind of split sample between that same venture funding data, but with where the countries that have what I call high economic need, they're below the mean per capita income, and ones with low economic need. And what you find is those results that I just showed you are much more pronounced in countries that have much lower than average in the sample per capita income. Pretty consistent with that notion of where there's greater need, that female effect is greater as well. And then this one I think is interesting. It's data from the World Bank Development Indicators that tells us a little bit about the percentage of women in the home country that are engaged in small business operations, which you could say is a great opportunity for women, or you could say it's about oppressing women, forcing them after they do the work at home to go out and run a fruit stand and the like. I'll use the word opportunity and I'll use it in quotes for it. Again, you can split the countries up into higher and lower opportunity. It's just that whatever the sample mean is, and you find that the effects, the women, the gender-related venture funding effect of remittances is more pronounced, more positive in the context of countries with higher entrepreneurial opportunity for women. Incidentally, if you replace that and look at the percentage of women in government, ministerial, and sub-ministerial positions, so that one we could look at as a positive development, you get the same effects. So it's whether women have more opportunity in the private sector or in the public sector, other things being equal, those remittances that they send back move the Dow more. Uganda is a perfect country for high need, high entrepreneurial opportunity, a higher percentage of women in government. It just fits this perfectly. That's the kind of poster child for the results I'm reporting to you. So let me stop and just leave you with this. I think the micro and macro data, if you did them just one or the other, there are a lot of holes you can shoot, and I'm looking forward to your shooting in a minute. When you put them together, they help to, I think, preempt some of those shots, because the micro data tell us about intent. The macro data tell us about effects. The micro data tell us that with the leverage on some gender background, education, where they live and the like, the macro data give us leverage in terms of model identification. And together, I think what they tell us is women are more likely than men to remit to invest. How do women differ as venture investors? They're more likely to engage in it. And that basic insight alone is really important for both research and these debates. So when women are in a position to engage in this, they're more likely to act in it. And we could go back and think about what it might tell us in other settings, not necessarily in that Silicon Valley venture capital firm, but frankly, I don't care so much about that. There's much more venture investing going on with those $500 to $600 billion that are going to developing countries that matter more than what happens over at some shishi joint in San Francisco. So I'm really interested, and I think it tells us that women are more likely to make those investments, take those risks, and they do it especially where there's greater need and where I think there's opportunity. And that has, I think, really important implications that I hope I get a chance to let you know as we answer your questions, both for management and entrepreneurship research, but probably more importantly, for economic development in the developing world. Let me stop there. Thank you, and take your questions. And I'm going to try to unshare my screen if that's okay.
Thanks, Paul.
And your colleagues.
Questions, colleagues?
And I'm really bad at picking up the participants here. Here we go. So I'm not sure. Let's see. Attendees, here we go. So if you have any of you have questions, and you can either raise your hand or whatever that is through there, or just shout them out. That works for me either way. And if you could, make sure you unmute yourself, and then just tell me who you are when you're asking the question. That would be great.
I'm actually allowing them to talk. I'm still learning this technology.
That's okay.
I'm allowing all of them to talk so they can unmute themselves.
And I see some of your faces.
Yeah,
I'm familiar
so
with our seminar back at WITS. That's great.
Okay. Colleagues, questions to Paul? Because I have questions, but I want you guys to start.
Why don't you fire away, Emmanuel, and we'll see if that primes the pump with it. It's throwing a lot at people quickly, and for some, it may be a familiar context. For many, it's just not. I got into this because on a dare. I work in a faculty with a lot of individuals who are not migrants. But Silas, did you have a comment? Or Claudia?
Okay, I have a question, Paul. So
Okay.
it's more about, let me kickstart this. More about your, the macro data, the way you put the macro data together. I mean, the model. Aren't you, when I look at those right-hand side variables of yours, a lot of those things are collinear, right? You have GDP, you have GDP growth. A typical economist would be a little bit worried about that. Do you worry about that from a more managerial side of this empirical specification of yours, or not to worry?
So the right-hand side variables are driven by a few things. They're driven by what you see in the research on remittance effects more generally, and then they're driven by what reviewers and editors tell me to put in. And it's an interesting thing because the editors and reviewers, I'll go work from the back to the front. The editors and reviewers I've been publishing this largely in management, in international business, entrepreneurship journals. And so maybe what's going on, they need to talk to guys like you about what you put on the right-hand side. What I generally try to tell them is the goal is to understand the within subjects trend over time of remittances and venture funding. So what I'm really concerned about is controlling for the cross-country effects that are there. So the dummies are there for that. The time dummies are trying to capture unique, idiosyncratic. In many ways, the simplest way to do this is just a lag-dependent variable model. The most likely thing that affects venture funding this year is venture funding last year. And in many ways, that takes care of pretty much all the variation. And that's what that dynamic panel model really gets at. We strip down most of those right-hand side variables. We first difference out the country effects, and then we essentially instrument for the lag DV and the remittances. I think one other, maybe it's growth. That's about it. The others are really there because that's what they suggest. But I hear you. Which of those right-hand side variables, Manuel, strike you as most problematic for either deletion or for remeasurement? Which ones? I'd be really curious. Your thoughts on that.
So I'm going to your slides. So for instance, you have log of GDP and economic growth and GDP per capita on together. They bother me a little bit because they are essentially the same.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And in the context, if you have all three there, then what happens, I guess, is you either have a multicollinearity, or
I think either Paul or myself is dead.